Since the earliest tales told around campfires and hearths, mythical creatures have always played an important role in the collective imagination. Among them, goblins stand out as small, mischievous, and often malicious figures. With a history spanning centuries, goblins have transformed from simple villains to more complex symbols in modern narratives. But behind their pointed ears and grotesque features, what is the true story of the goblin? What do they tell us about fear, the unknown, and even humanity itself? The term goblin traces back to Old French gobelin, a word that referred to a mischievous spirit, often associated with haunted places and objects moved by invisible forces. These spirits were not merely mythical beings, they represented fear and insecurity. Initially, they were beings associated with chaos and destruction, with no major stories or defining characteristics. However, as the concept of the goblin evolved, these creatures began to be depicted in various forms. In different cultures, we find beings similar to goblins, with similar behaviors and characteristics. In Zulu mythology, for example, there is the Tokoloshi, a mischievous and malevolent being with supernatural powers. In other places, such as England, Puck was a mischievous spirit capable of deceiving and manipulating humans, but unlike the evil goblins, he was seen as somewhat protective of certain places and people. In Germany, kobolds are creatures that can either help or harm humans, depending on how they are treated. Turning our attention to the north, we find another figure related to the goblin, the troll in Norse mythology. Although trolls are described as larger and more monstrous than goblins, their similarities are undeniable. Like goblins, trolls were often villains in stories, wild and primitive beings who lived in caves and remote forests, often posing a direct threat to anyone who ventured into their lands. But while goblins were more agile and cunning, trolls were large and brutish, still equally hostile. In various medieval texts, goblins were commonly linked to malevolent forces. One example is the belief in goblins as mischievous spirits responsible for disruptions, often seen in medieval homes. During this time, goblins were also portrayed as shadowy tricksters who might cause harm to humans through acts of mischief. The goblins of folklore were agents of unpredictability, and their role was one of both mischief and malice. Their influence expanded from folk tales to become symbols of societal anxieties, representing the fear of the unknown and of things that were not easily understood. As mythology evolved over time, goblins began to gain more depth, especially in literature and cinema. In The Lord of the Rings, for instance, J.R.R. Tolkien transformed goblins into a subrace of orcs, malicious and treacherous creatures that inhabit mines and caves. While they were still villains, Tolkien's goblins were described in more detail, with a backstory that made them more complex. They are described as creatures motivated by greed, destruction, and servitude to darker forces, but also with their own internal struggles. In Dungeons & Dragons, goblins became part of the game ecosystem, no longer just simple enemies, but a race with its own characteristics, weaknesses, and strengths. They were clever, fast, and sneaky, and their intelligence, often underestimated, made them formidable opponents. But more than that, they started to be seen as characters with their own motivations, not just agents of evil. Goblins in D&D are often depicted as surviving in harsh environments, using their quick wit and resourcefulness to navigate challenges. Additionally, in popular culture, goblins gained new meanings. In the 1986 film Labyrinth, the iconic Goblin King, played by David Bowie, presents a more complex and even charming version of the creature, transforming it into a central figure in the narrative, far from the stereotype of a mere monster. Similarly, in The Black Cauldron, goblins are depicted as mischievous creatures, but not necessarily evil, with their own agendas and desires. These portrayals explore the idea that goblins are not merely monsters, but characters with depth, whose actions can serve a broader narrative purpose. However, goblins did not completely disappear from their role as villains. We still see them in various franchises, such as in Spider-Man, with the Green Goblin, or in Harry Potter, with the character of Gringotts, where they maintain a more ambiguous image, acting as complex and multifaceted characters. What began as a representation of a simple, grotesque villain has become a more interesting metaphor about morality, survival, and adaptation over time. In Spider-Man, the Green Goblin is a tragic figure, representing the duality of human nature and the corrupting influence of power. This portrayal adds depth to the character, moving away from the idea of the goblin as a mere antagonist. Another important example of how goblins have been reinterpreted is in the Warcraft universe, where they are portrayed as a race of intelligent engineers and merchants. While they still retain their grotesque appearance, the goblins in Warcraft are known for their inventions and technological abilities, as well as their inclination for negotiation and profit. This transformation reflects how mythological figures can be modernized to fit new contexts, making goblins less about pure villainy and more about characters with their own complexities and goals. In Warcraft, goblins are often depicted as survivalists, manipulating systems and technologies to maintain power and influence, further enhancing their complexity as characters. Yet it was not always this way. When we look at the origins of goblins, we can see that their figure was rooted in harmful stereotypes, especially in medieval Europe. At that time, they were often depicted with physical characteristics that resembled anti-Semitic caricatures of the era, such as large noses and grotesque features. This aligns with the idea that goblins were symbols of xenophobia, used to reflect the fear of the other, of people considered different or strange. These figures were used as a way to project the fears and prejudices of society onto those who were marginalized. These stereotypes, although problematic, followed goblins for centuries. But over time, their representations began to change. In modern media, they have moved away from the simple villainous creatures and have been portrayed in more nuanced ways. In Warcraft, for example, goblins are no longer just villains. They are characters with their own motivations, capabilities, and weaknesses. Similarly, in Dungeons and Dragons, where their roles and characteristics were redefined, these more modern portrayals have helped free the goblin from its negative historical connotations, allowing the creature to evolve into a more flexible figure. The goblin figure, with all its complexity and various transformations, remains a vital part of our collective imagination. Its journey from villain to multifaceted character shows how myths can be adapted and reinterpreted over time, reflecting the changes in the societies that created them. And perhaps it is this ability to transform that makes goblins so fascinating, how such small beings can carry such a powerful symbolic and historical weight, reflecting our fears, our social issues, and above all our capacity for change. The goblin's ability to adapt and evolve through different media, mythologies, and cultures reflects the broader human condition itself, our constant reinvention of ourselves and our stories to make sense of the world around us.